Hello friends, and welcome back to the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature's podcast, Conversations with Mother Nature, a space in which we will discuss the growing global movement that is the rights of nature. In this episode, we discuss the inextricable connections between Indigenous knowledge and the growing rights of nature movement. For that, we are joined by Camp Horinek and Tom Goldtooth. Casey is a woman of the Ponca Nation and has long stood up to protect the inherent rights of the living world. She is the chair of the Indigenous Council of GARN and has sown many seeds of change in her life. Casey was instrumental in the drafting and adoption of the first ever International Indigenous Women's Treaty protecting the rights of nature. A single podcast cannot do justice to all of the diverse and complex work that Casey has done and continues to do. We hope that listening to her speak here and now encourages you to follow and learn more about her work going forwards. Casey will be joined by a fellow ally of GARN, Tom Goldtooth. Tom is Diné in Dakota and lives in Minnesota. Tom is the Executive Director of the Indigenous Environmental Network and a voice of wisdom, reason, and guidance to many. Tom has become an internationally renowned environmental, climate, and economic justice leader, working with many Indigenous people and social movements worldwide. Additionally, Tom is a member of the GARN Executive Committee. A very warm welcome for both Casey and Tom. Thank you for joining us in another episode of this podcast. We'll leave the floor to you.
Thank you. Good to see you, relative.
Yes, good to see you as well.
You know, you've been in this movement longer than I have, so I'd like to leave it to you to kind of kick us off in a good way.
Oh, okay. Well, whenever I talk about the Mother Earth and talk about the Father Sky, and talk about this term, Eurocentric term called nature. I have to always look at it from my indigenous perspectives, not only my Diné Navajo way, but also Bedewa Kantawan, Dakota way, and break things down that way. So my elders told me whenever you talk about the Mother Earth, whenever you talk about the Father Sky, you're talking about spiritual things. You're talking about the cosmovision of who we are. So this discussion on the rights of nature, the rights of Mother Earth, I have to always look at it from a spiritual perspective. That's the way I was taught to do it, and so I just want to make sure that there's some grounding on this discussion. In my way, I already prepared for this talk by putting out some tobacco out on the Mother Earth, preparing for this. And putting a context to the listeners, whoever is going to be watching this recording, to put a prayer out there, which I already did. And so I want to start out in acknowledging that relationship. So we have a lot to talk about, and through a lot of ceremony, I've been participating in the rights of nature, the rights of the earth, and I wasn't the original one, but there were many others that I talked to said, when you talk about nature, you're talking about Mother Earth. So you will see the rights of Mother Earth as well in this discussion. So to put another deeper context to this discussion, is that as we talk about our relationship as Indigenous peoples, a relationship from our people, whether it's the Dene, Navajo, the Dakota nations, the Ponca, but many other Indigenous nations. I've also talked about this to Indigenous peoples of the global South. And I find there's something in common as we're talking about nature, is that we break it down. We break it down and talk about the Mother Earth and the relationship to the Mother Earth. And that's how we are raised to understand, to respect our responsibilities and our duties as Indigenous peoples ever since we've been raised as little kids, is to respect Mother Earth as we walk upon her body, and to always look to the sky and appreciate the sun, the elements, the rain, the snow. So it's about a relationship. It's about a relationship for the rivers. It's a relationship to the many animals, the plants. It's about a relationship. Mitakie in Dakota is about relationship. So it's about a relationship. So that's the way I look at this movement. And what do I have to contribute to this movement? So I have to come from my Indigenous perspective, my framework. And I've talked to my relative, Casey Camp Horinek, many times about these concepts, and she also shares that in her teachings. So it's that offering of our knowledge as Indigenous peoples that's traditional, that goes way back to the beginning of time in our original instructions on who we are to be. So we're sharing this concept to many of the descendants who came from Europe, that starting to understand the concerns and issues around property rights, for an example. Property rights and ownership, dominion over the earth, over nature, over everything. So, to keep it simple, it's about relationship, and it's about our inherent relationship as Indigenous peoples in many of the parts of the world where we are the original. We have inherent rights where we live, to the land, to the rivers, to the air. And our Indigenous jurisprudence, our Indigenous laws, our jurisprudence is very critical in this discussion. Thank you.
I'd love to hear you talk. It reminds me of so many things every time we do speak. And when I'm honored to be on this podcast with you, my relative, and to listen to you every time I do. And it brings up the things that I feel as well in terms of relationship, because I know within the Ponca way of being and within our speech, we don't even have a word that just says nature. Nature by itself, or rights for that matter. And it took me a long time to be able to understand exactly what people were talking about, what these human beings were proposing when they talked to me about rights of nature. How do we implement that? How do we bring that forth? And that's been quite a few years ago. We were at a meeting with 100 women from around the globe at the time, and it was the first time I heard this term. And it, to me, was startling, because ordinarily when there are laws created, for instance, like this rights of nature movement is about using both Western laws and the natural laws, and somehow meshing those in a manner in which the colonial people, the colonists, can understand that there is a parameter of respect, love, honor, and duty in our relationship to all living things. And it's what they call nature. They look at a tree oftentimes, which to us is a relative that shares breath for breath, that has a scientific value to them, but has a relationship value to us, which we would really have to go deep to explain. But they might look at a tree and see it as a plank to build something with, or a way to make a new kind of chair and to sell it. And what we consider sources of life, they call resources. It's a whole different manner of looking at and understanding what those natural laws are, what those original instructions are. And I know among my people, because my teachings primarily came from my mama, my grandmas, my aunties, as the youngest daughter, the youngest one in the family. I took care of Mama, and the women folks around me. They took care of me first, of course, when I was a child and a baby. But I was always with them. That was my place. As you know, I only had older brothers and one older sister, much older than me. And so sitting and listening to them, being raised by them, they were the first generation born in captivity, is how I always say it. Because my grandma and grandpas and ancestors came from the old country, only knew that one way of being. And my mother was born on a reservation here after the forced removal. And so her knowledges came from those original ways of being of the Ponca people. Sacred head, that's what Ponca means. And we lived, as you know, up in Nebraska and South Dakota, they call it right now. Those values that you talk about, I thought were family values. I thought they were Ponca values. I thought they were the teachings of the way that we were supposed to interact with all living things, and that Wakanda, the great mystery, the Mother Earth, the Father Sky, the winds, all of those things that are part of natural law, are part of what they call nature, were seen as something that was a gift and a relative, not separate from us. And so whenever I remember growing up and getting to these stages in life of a young mother and being part of the American Indian movement and growing into various ages of my life and coming into elderhood, was the time that here in the global aspect of us, and they look at our cosmology, they understand now what we grew up understanding. That we're not separate from nature, that virtually every breath we take, every bite that we eat, every drink that we take is just one more way of physically, spiritually, mentally, and emotionally connecting us with all that is. And so for me as an elder Ponca woman to be participating as what they call indigenous wisdom, or a wisdom keeper, or in indigenous leadership, comes as a surprise to me, and I bet it does to you too, because this is just what we grew up in. This is what we've learned from those all around us. And globally, our indigenous relatives have virtually the same understanding, but coming from and informed from the land and the water where they live. And it's been interesting to hear the songs in relationship to the wind or the water or the ice or the fire from other places. And I know you felt that too. We've been in many ceremonies together where we've heard and felt these ways of our indigenous relatives and their inherent understanding and connection to. So rights of nature, when I was on council for the Ponca tribe down here, put in that position by my people, over the years I began to understand the connections, because we still have to deal with the federal government being in our business as tribal entities. As tribal people representing others, we have that government-to-government relationship. Even though they've broken every treaty, we're still holding them to understand that we still have our ways. That's how we say it. We still have our ways. We still understand what it is that's necessary for our people. Our women folks, we're at home all the time. We see the struggles in our families, in our homes, in our youth, in our elders, and we know that there are things that we have to set in place. That's why we took the approach to create a statute that is called Rights of Nature, but within that statute was all of those values you and I just talked about. And more. We included things about the rights to free, prior, and informed consent from the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. We included all of the things that we could think of, including the right of climate itself to exist. Because in this time of climate chaos, we have to think not in those linear terms, because we do have that piece of paper. We do have to write these things down, pass them through the Bureau of Indian Affairs, put them into another jurisdiction of law. But it comes back to what is it that we firmly believe in, that we see a way through to be able to hold the extractive industry in our territory responsible for the harm they do, and understanding that if they're harming the water, they're harming everything with roots, the fins, the deer that come and drink from it, the well water that feeds our people, the eagles that have a nest in the tree next to the river itself, and the water herself. She has a right to exist. So we also added a few years later the rights of the river being recognized, not giving it rights, recognizing those rights because they exist. Natural law will continue. This purification of earth in this time of chaos will continue. If it takes a tornado, if it takes whatever it is to help heal the things that humankind has done in overstepping its greed and its search for comfort. Yeah. Oh, now you got me started, relative.
Yeah. Well, it's a big discussion, my relative, as you know. And my relative Casey, we've been part of an indigenous movement that's been all about what she spoke about and what I'm talking about. It's about challenging a dominant system that has introduced a concept of dominion over the Mother Earth.
Yes.
And it's a very patriarchy too. Male dominant, dominion over women, dominion over the Mother Earth. So when we talk about these cosmovision as indigenous peoples, and talk within our allies within the movement of the rights of nature, many times we have to struggle to convey that relationship we have and challenge a whole dominant system that has legal systems, frameworks of ownership and property rights over all of life. And that's why it's important that we start looking at our indigenous traditional knowledge And that has a basis and a foundation to it. It's an indigenous legal framework that dominant societies do not want to recognize. Extractive industry don't want to recognize our indigenous knowledge and our legal frameworks and inherent relationship jurisprudence that put a focus on the legal applications by our indigenous nations as sovereign entities. So this is, my relatives, why we need to continue to talk about our analysis and how we are to apply a Mother Earth-centered legal and cultural framework that focuses on, what we're talking about. And that's why I love to talk about this, focusing on jurisprudence based on our inherent relationship again between indigenous peoples, North and South, the Pacific, and our connection to land and water and air, but also other non-rights-based inherent responsibilities. And it's like pathways or roads, the red road we call it in the North, that based upon our responsibilities and our duties. That's part of our customary law, our own indigenous customary law based upon our practices, our culture, our spiritual ways. And as you know, we are families that have struggled for generations defending our treaty rights, our reserved rights, our inherent reserved rights, our treaties here in the North, and our traditional knowledge. So thank you for having this discussion. And we are always looking for an equitable relationship of looking at of solidarity, with the movement of indigenous rights and the movement of the rights of nature.
It's amazing to see how it's grown. It's amazing to remember, I was telling these relatives about our trip to Ecuador to see how rights of nature had fit into the Constitution there, led by the indigenous people and indigenous knowledge. And it is really beautiful to see that over 30 countries have embraced now the rights of nature. And working with all the different nations here, the hundreds and hundreds of different nations that are still alive and viable in their traditional ways here on Turtle Island, to see how many are looking towards rights of nature as a path forward for what is really bothering them.
Yeah, it's part of prophecy. Before I started to get involved with this movement, which is about two decades ago, I saw that Ecuador, through their constitution, passed a law on the rights of nature. And I really looked at that. Is that going to work? A lot of questions. But I took it into ceremony about what is this phenomena of a lot of the people who are not indigenous, steadying this issue of recognition of the rights of nature. And in ceremony, they said this is part of the prophecy of people coming back to understanding who they are. And maybe they haven't conceptualized that term for that. But we have, in our language on the Dakota side, mitakia pi giksuyapi. Mitakia pi giksuyapi. Remembering who you are. Remember who you are is very important, because these concepts that we are talking about, my relative, you understand this, is that we were taught this. To be who we are is also to stand in defense and to protect the sacredness of that female creative principle of Mother Earth. Father Sky and Mother Earth, the principle of creation, is very sacred. So that's why we always strengthen ourselves when we go into those United Nations climate meetings, negotiations, even here domestically at the United States or Canada. We have to really look clearly with critical thinking about these so-called mitigation of the climate crisis. What is the solution that the corporations, the world banks, the governments are looking at to address the climate crisis? They're not looking at the real solutions of keeping fossil fuels in the ground, to have a phase out of fossil fuels. At every one of these United Nations meetings, as you know, and you've been to these meetings, we keep hearing excuses. And I'm sure it frustrates you. It does me, but I feel sad. I feel sad for society that comes up with false solutions. They're looking at, as you know, the financialization of nature. They're looking at bringing the carbon that's part of the air into a market system of capitalism. And before, as you and me have talked to these governments and large non-governmental organizations, is the question, is the ethics of bringing nature, trees, grass, so even the soil, the ground, the carbon that's in these elements of life, to bring it into a market system. And before you trade and treat carbon as a commodity, they have to determine whose property right carbon is. It's just something that is difficult for me, I'm sure with you, when we take this information back to our communities, especially the spiritual leaders and our women's societies and the youth, to try to understand this is what's happening. And so this is a part of a society that does not recognize the spirit of Mother Earth, the spirit of the earth. Even the air is the spirit, and the carbon, it's out of balance. There's too much carbon in the atmosphere. It's like a bathtub that's overflowing with too much carbon. So that's why this movement on rights of nature is very much needed to wake up the dominant society of the world, humanity, that we have to reevaluate as all people, as humanity, our relationship to the sacredness of Mother Earth. That's why I participate in it, and that's why we have many other people that we're working with to continue to challenge a system that gets stubborn. Way ya, way yo, hey, 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 yo, way, hey, hey, yo, way ya, way yo, hey, 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 way ya, way yo, hey, hey, way, hey, hey, yo, yo, way Yahweh yo hey yo. So even our songs are teachings on what my relative Casey and me have been talking about. Mitaki Awasi. Thank you.
We're truly honoured to have been joined by Casey and Tom here at Conversations with Mother Nature. We're grateful for their invaluable insights, knowledge and generosity. We thank them for their time and their words, and we thank the listeners for tuning in today. We hope you enjoyed the company of Casey and Tom as much as we did. Thank you, and we hope you join us again next time at Conversations with Mother Nature.